My name is Osman Butt, and you're watching Middle East Monitor Live Conversations. My guest today is Professor Arzoo Osanloo. Professor Osanloo teaches at the University of Washington. She is a legal anthropologist with research interests in gender, Islamic studies, and anthropology. Her latest book is called, her most recently released book is Forgiveness Works, which is a book that explores the Iranian legal system in regards to murder and crimes of that nature. It's a very interesting book, and I would encourage all of our audience to go out and read it. It's really interesting because in Iran, they have a very different approach to how we treat murders, say, in the United Kingdom or the United States. The murders in Iran are treated as private crimes, or what we would call tort crimes, and they are usually considered crimes against the family, whereas in the United Kingdom and the United States, murder is regarded as a crime against the state. And Osanloo has termed this as a victim-centric approach. So, Professor Osanloo, welcome to Middle East Monitor Conversations Live.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to talk about my book.
So Forgiveness Works takes us into the heart of the Iranian legal system with regards to crime of murder. Could you outline for us further details about how Iran approaches killings and why is it distinct from Western legal approaches? You describe Iran as a victim-centric legal system. What do you mean by this?
Well, it's basically what you said in the introduction. So essentially, murder is treated as a tort. Individuals who are the injured parties have a greater claim to punishment of the perpetrator than the state does. So it is, if the victim is still alive, it's actually the victim in other harms, other than murder. And of course, in murder, it's the victim's immediate family. In the US and other jurisdictions, US, like the United Kingdom, has what we call common law system. And it is the state that possesses the right of in-kind retribution. And I know in the UK, you don't have the death penalty, and some states in the United States here still do. Now, while victims' families in these jurisdictions may sue for damages in a civil action, in the US, it's often called an unlawful death suit. This can only happen after the state's prosecution of the murder cases. In the unlawful death suits, the damages are usually monetary. However, in Iran, the tort of murder is prosecuted by the family of the victim first. And the family of the victim can ask for in-kind retribution, including the maximum, death, but they could also forego it altogether. They could also reach a settlement with the perpetrator. In Iran, once the victim's family does, forego this ultimate punishment, then and only then will the state step in and prosecute for harms, but not for murder. Harms against sort of public security, public safety. And to be clear, it's not a murder prosecution. It's a prosecution for public harm in which the maximum sentence levied is only between 3 and 10 years. And this includes time served. So if the perpetrator was in prison for 6 years while the family of the victim was trying to decide on a settlement, and then they decided to forgive, then the maximum, the person could still only stay 4 more years, tops. So when I say victim-centered approach, I mean that this decision to seek in-kind retribution is a right of the immediate family members of the victim. And this is true in all torts. And what's important to consider as well is that it is the right of each, and it is the individual right of each and every immediate, that is blood relative, so not spouses, to decide. So this right is also akin to a property right because it can be inherited. if the original holder of that right passes, then the heirs will have to decide. So for a perpetrator to avoid retribution, every holder of this right must forego it.
Yes, and it's an interesting one as well, because you, in your book, you actually spend a lot of time, and in fact, when you first got interested in this concept, you mentioned in your book you were going to Iran, and it was your grandfather, I believe, who had passed, but it was an accident, or he was hit by something. And when you went to the house where your grandfather was, because he was preparing for your visit, you saw a strange ritual almost taking place, where the person who was who hit your grandfather in the car, it was a car, wasn't it? He got hit.
It was a van, yeah.
Yes, came to seek forgiveness, but it wasn't just him coming to seek forgiveness. There was a whole, almost, you describe it as a kind of script, a social script going on, where everyone knew the rituals that were going on here and what was being asked of, how to ask for forgiveness, whether we should forgive or not. There was an entire social script already constructed, but this was to you, this seemed very strange at the time, but to everyone else, it seemed perfectly normal.
Yes, yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I mean, at the time I was doing my doctoral research on a completely different project on the politics of women's rights. I had not been to Iran since we came to America in 1970, and it was 1999. And it is a very sad story that implicates me in some way, because my grandfather was preparing the house for me coming. And he, 79, very spry old man who would get up and climb mountains every morning, decided to run across a 4-lane highway. And unfortunately, he was hit by a van that was going very fast. People who know Iran know that car accidents have been a major area for accidents, and the government has been trying to address this. And yes, my grandfather passed away. It was just 2 weeks before we were to come. So what I did see was the unfolding of what happened after, and these cultural rituals where the driver of the van, a young man, I think he was in his early 20s, he came to ask for forgiveness. He came to the house. And of course, there's a lot of layers of concern, the honor of my uncles who wanted to show sort of their masculine virility or something, to say, no, we don't want this. But a person who really had to decide was my grandmother. And she really took into account this person being youthful and what we would call in America the contributory negligence of my grandfather running across a 4-lane highway. But that was, I think, the first experience that I had with this. And when I started to do this project for a completely different reason, I realized that I saw a lot of these kinds of rituals of what we call stopping short, kuta omadan, or trying to resolve a dispute by stopping short, by not going as far as you can to have the fight, So these things are embedded and ingrained in the everyday life of people. So I realized that it's not just something codified. It's much deeper than that. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it is. And because it gets onto my point, my next question, which is that in your book, for example, you describe that these kinds of rituals and cultural norms are something that has existed in Iran for a very long time. It ties partly to the history of Iran as a country. It ties to Shiism and Islam in that country, but also you're dealing with a country which is historically, adopted the Napoleonic legal codes in the late 19th century, and you have a more move towards a more state-centric approach. But as we sort of get to 1979, we sort of begin to see this changing again. And in some ways, because it sees itself as a revolutionary type system, it has to sort of deliver on the idea that the people come first, the people are, they are the victims. And so they need to be recentered again. And this sort of relates to what's happened since then, because these concepts which you talk about in your book, which are forbearance and forgiveness, these are two big central themes of your book. The issue, of course, for the state perspective is that these are often personal choices an individual makes. But what the Iranian government have learnt, and as you wrote a little bit about in your book, it's a little bit difficult to say that as a political system, we're going to allow people to do these ideas because they're still the function of government. So there's an unofficial and an official incorporation of these ideas into the system, and it's still evolving even as we speak now. So it's because it's not just obviously the state's legal system, it's also the social responses they want as well. So could you perhaps tell us a little bit more about this? Why has this come about, and what are these concepts?
That's just an excellent question. And, the book really delves into that more than I can say here. But, after the revolution, the newly formed and named Islamic Republic set itself upon the task of revising the laws to conform to the Sharia Shad, as they, the leaders, saw it. And this included major revisions to two areas of law. One, which I wrote about in my first book, was the family law, the marriage law, laws of marriage and family. And the second was criminal laws, because these are areas that ostensibly the Shad has spoken on. So they don't want outside influences. And you mentioned that the state sees this as its responsibility, and yet in the Quran, very specific verses note that this is the victim's choice. So the state has to make this very interesting balance of maintaining its monopoly on legitimate violence while also giving victims the right to retribution. So I think what I argue in the book, what happened was, immediately following the revolution, they revamped the laws, and they did not finalize, people don't realize this, but they did not finalize the criminal laws. And by that, I mean the substantive criminal code and the code of criminal procedure until 2012 and 2015, respectively. And this is while I was doing this project. What they had were sort of provisional laws in place that they renewed every 5 years. And during this time, we can think about the Islamic Republic. It was going through a war, multiple sanctions, economic crises. So we could say that the state was building its sovereign power, its sovereign authority. And the laws were stark and severe. And I think it wasn't until a much later period of relative stability where these latest revisions, the final form of the law, 2012 and 2015, actually include provisions that encourage forbearance. Indeed, I would add, the Code of Criminal Procedure compels, in legal speak, we would say creates an affirmative duty on all judicial officials to try to help the parties reach a settlement. But as you know, the state is also really concerned, as a sovereign authority, with maintaining its impartiality in order to be a judicious arbiter, right, of the law. They have to be impartial. So what's really important is that this encouragement to forego retribution should come only after the case has been tried and the ruling handed down. And the final decision to forego retribution should ultimately be left up to the family of the victim. And in fact, the family of the victim must submit a statement to the court that always includes a phrase that they forego without doubt or uncertainty. بدون شک یا تردید. So the state is always in charge, even through the giving of this right to the victims' families.
Yes, and this actually leads into the next question, which is about, because the way you did this is you spent a good amount of time, like 10 years, going back and forth to Iran to research this, and you actually went and interviewed and spent a lot of time in courtrooms with a variety of different peoples, from judges to defendants to activists and all sorts of people, which you initially said that this wasn't initially something you planned to do. You thought it would be more of a legislative focused book, and instead we get something else. And when you talk about that sort of odd kind of tension in the Islamic Republic as it begins, when they realize they actually have to turn this into something, and they have to, and it's really interesting when you start talking about the judges and the roles they play, because there's an instance where you give where one of the judges passes sentence in his courtroom capacity. He then takes off, he almost transforms once the verdict's done. Now I've got to facilitate the forgiveness part, the social part. So the judge is also a kind of social worker in their own right. So could you talk a little bit more about this, like these sort of people you've interviewed and the sort of stories they told you around this?
Yes, thank you again for that awesome question. So I found that quite shocking, what you just described, where the judge would hand down the ruling and then immediately become a mediator, a mianjigar. And this was a huge source of critique as well among defense lawyers and social workers in Iran, who said to me, like these judges, they give this sentence and then they turn around and then call us and tell us, get the family to forgive. Like, why do they give the sentence in the first place? So I literally asked the judges. And what I learned is, if you read the code, which I did, it's what we would call in the US strict liability. Qisas, the punishment for intentional murder. The intentional murder is actually very broad. If there was to be any reforms, many law professors in Iran have told me they really need to change the way, that all-encompassing way that intentional murder is defined. But it is strict liability. So once the prosecution makes the case for intentional murder, and it's rather easy to do, and I describe that in the book, the judge has no choice but to hand down the punishment of qisas, or in-kind retribution.
Yeah.
Once that happens, that's the judicial aspect. Once that is done, you can actually draw a line. The proceeding is over. The judge literally said, the trial is over. Now we move to another phase. And the judge can now step down from this judicial perch as the arbiter of truth and the fact finder to now becoming the mediator, or mianjigar. And it is quite a stark shift to behold in the courtroom. And I have to say, it's very, very rare that that would happen at a snap of the finger like that. It usually takes days, months, years. In the specific case that this happened, where I describe in the book, I asked the judge afterwards, like, how did you know to do that? And he knew from various filings and what had happened in the trial that the family of the victim, which in that case happened to be the aunts and uncles of the perpetrators, were open to the suggestion. And in their family, the judges held a very respected role. I can say more. I don't know if you want to step in, but I could move a little bit beyond to other forgiveness workers if you want.
We have a question on activists and stuff in a minute. So,
okay.
Because I think what was interesting as well as you mentioned, there was a judge whose own was it his own father that was murdered,
Father was
and
murdered.
he had to preside over the trial of the murderer.
Not his, no, not that. He didn't
Oh,
have to
okay.
preside over the trial of the murderer of his father. But what he said to me, and this person is, um, this particular judge is very well known in Iran. There's actually been a documentary made about him, Aziz Mohammadi, for your viewers. He's written books, memoirs. He was also a judge before the revolution, and he showed me his picture wearing a tie. But what happened was he used his own story in court with victims' families when he would, because the first question the court asks is to the family of the victims, what do you want? And of course, invariably, many of them say, we want retribution in kind, we want qisas. And then the judge will say, nothing else? I mean, you can forego, you can make a deal, you can make a settlement. And that's when the judge would use his own story and say, look, my own father, and this, and I remember talking to the judge about it, where he said, how could I try to get people in the court to forego retribution if I didn't? And it was a very interesting phenomenon to watch.
Yeah, and then the last question to do with the courts. I mean, you describe a really interesting case where there was this case where a man was on trial for killing a woman, and there was a lot of accusations flying around. So he claimed that he was in a consensual sexual relationship with this young woman and that they were doing drugs, and then she died as I suppose, an overdose. But the family alleges this didn't happen and that she was murdered and this was a sexual assault. But what was interesting in your description of that is how the judge himself was very aware of the damaging nature of these kinds of accusations against the deceased. And he saw it as a kind of, he had to protect the honor of the dead woman and not just buy into or believe these accusations, but be very careful about how they came out in the courtrooms. And you said this is interesting because even in death, he's still trying to protect her honor. But I think it's also interesting from another perspective, because we have this idea that in general, and this is across all societies, when a woman is accused of sexual impropriety of some kind or promiscuity, it's almost automatically accepted and believed, and it tarnishes her. But here, he seems to be very aware of this problem and is actually trying to mitigate it in a way.
That's right. I have written separately about the persistence of concerns with honor, both in societies like Iran and in Europe and North America. And the difference is, I think, that in Iran, because of this type of criminal code, the use of honor is explicit. Whereas in the criminal codes where it's, the state is prosecuting the murder, so we don't hear about honor, but it's still there. And you hear it in the victims' impact statements and so on and so forth, in the US at least. But what happens in these cases is that the judges, yes, they have to be very attuned to the fact that within the courtroom, information could be revealed that could harm the possibility or likelihood of the perpetrator receiving forgiveness or forbearance. And the gendered implications of this are huge. And it's a very significant part of what I write about, because many of the cases I write about, one reviewer noticed that 90% of the cases are intimate violence cases that I write about. And the family of the victims often feel that if they are not going through with the most severe punishment, that is execution or capital punishment, then somehow they are not honoring the victim, or somehow they are buying into the story that the perpetrator is telling. And so the judges have to find a way, and not just the judges, but all of this, what I call this cottage industry of forgiveness workers, they all have to work in this very delicate balance to, tell the truth, to convince the family of the victim, and at the same time, not to upset or anger the family of the victim so much so that there's no going back, that the honor of our child. So what the case that you're talking about, the perpetrator was using the fact of the drugs. It was a case in which the girl actually fell off a 5-story building, but he said she was drugged, and they were saying she was pushed by him. And so in order to defend his honor, he had to sort of dishonor her. I mean, in order to defend his life, he had to sort of dishonor her. And the mother, specifically the mother, got on the stand and said, my daughter was a good girl. She would never have done the things that he did. So you see that it was much more about her honor, and by extrapolation, the family's honor. And these tensions are created by the way that this law works out, you see, the way it unravels and operates in real time.
Which brings us to the role of civil society. Now, Iran has a huge, as you've just previously mentioned, cotton industry of what could be called social workers, civil society activists, who actively go out and try to get victims' families to forgive the person who's the perpetrator. And it's interesting, there was also actually a video by New York Times where they actually went around with these civil society activists as well. And so my question is related to what kind of work are they doing, and more importantly, why is there this strong sense or need to forgive in Iranian society? Why has this become such a big thing? And why are these activists the ones doing it? And yeah.
Thank you. I know we're running out of time, and that's kind of a big question. Let me preface this by saying that the entire second part of my book is about these social workers, activists, judges in the first part of the book, defense lawyers, even national celebrities, actors, athletes, and whatnot. And my most favorite line when I ask why do they do this was a judge who said to me, well, this is our religion and our legal duty, religious and legal duty. And I thought, how odd that a judge in the Islamic Republic of Iran would distinguish his religious and legal duties. But he did. And many of the people who were not judicial workers, social workers, these others with whom I spoke, I was very curious as to their motivations, because as I note in the book, it's very time consuming and could be expensive to fly, take trains, buses, whatever, to all different parts of the country. Some of them were themselves people who had forgiven. Some of them were anti-death penalty activists. Many of them started out their activism because of the religious duty, because the verses say, all of the verses reference the right of retribution, but forgiveness is better. And so the question is, like, where do you put the emphasis? And these people really put the emphasis on the aspect of forgiveness being better. And the civil society activists were trying to instill what they called a feeling of forgiveness, both in the family of the victim, but also into society at large, to create a shift in society where forgiveness was the more exalted value as opposed to retribution. Because sort of apart from what you're saying, many of my interlocutors felt like in urban areas, perhaps forgiveness is more exalted, but actually in rural areas, it's not. And I went to a meeting once where they said this, where we went to a mother whose son has died, and she said, if I forgive, what would the neighbors think? They would think, oh, she sold her son's blood for money. So that actually is a shift that's happening. But just to say something a little bit specific in the remaining time we have, in 1994, Iran acceded to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And part of that convention is one of the obligations is that they have to create civil society organizations for the education and protection of children. And through that grew societies to protect children and to lobby the government to change the law for executing under 18. And I should say, in the US, it was only in 2005 that this law changed as well. And the United States has never ratified the CRC. But in Iran, a lot of these activists got involved after the passage of the CRC because it opened the space for this kind of activism. Because one thing I should point out is secular anti-death penalty activism is not only frowned upon, it's actually dangerous, and some people in the government consider it a violation of the Shad, because the Shad has everything that's needed. And what the Shad has is the right of retribution with the possibility of forgiveness. So what we see is the meeting together here of a lot of anti-death penalty activists who are also working for forgiveness, but if they're trying to move the larger society towards forgiveness, it's also to ultimately, person by person, achieve the abolition of capital punishment, at least for the cases of murder. I'm not talking about other kinds of crimes, particularly crimes against the state.
Okay, and to finish off, Iran has recently elected a new president, Ibrahimi Raisi.
Yes.
I'm not going to ask you about what he's going to do in the future because we still don't know this, but it has been reported that he is somebody who was in the judiciary for a very long time, and he oversaw a lot of reforms within the judiciary, particularly related to drug offences and so on. Yeah. So could you talk a little bit more about him and the sort of things that he did back then?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak specifically to him. I never met him. I'm familiar with the revisions in the Code of Criminal Procedure and the Penal Code. And I can say that this final version of the code, the substantive criminal code, is a full third larger, bigger, with more provisions than the previous version. And what that addition, that 1/3 has, is a number of substantive changes that allow for substitute and alternative sentences, but mostly in the context of ta'zir. And ta'zir are often considered they're crimes for which the Shad has not specifically given a penalty, or there's no penalty. So these are more readily amendable, if you will. And so the drug law that you're talking about is ta'zir. And in 2018, Iran changed very dramatically the death penalty for the amount of drugs that someone can have. And I don't remember the exact amount, but that was a huge shift. Most of the executions in Iran were from drug crimes. But the way that this, this, I guess, might help in these, Shah-related ones, is that we see the revision or addition to the final version of the code. My judges talked about it as the code is finally being colored in, right? Like after the revolution, we had sort of the sketches of the criminal code, but now it's finally being colored in with substitute sentences, with alternate sentences, with reform sentences. So this could also lend itself to opening up avenues in these private torts for forbearance. And there is a provision in the criminal code that stipulates the kinds of conditions that victims' families can make to perpetrators, and it encourages them to do so. So it kind of, it's still made, because it's Shad, because it's Qisas, it's still dominated by what is considered to be unchangeable Islamic jurisprudence. But at the same time, by coloring in somewhat this Islamic jurisprudence, you can look for exceptions and alternatives to the ultimate sanction.
Coloring in book law, that's a very good way of thinking about it. And to Professor Osanloo, I'd like to thank you for being here, and to our audience, thank you for tuning in with Middle East Monitor Conversations Live. Tune in next week where we have more conversations. Thank you very much for being here.